You who don't know me, my name's Maddie, and today I'm going to be sharing with you a project that I was inspired to develop during my summer internship back in my home state of Michigan. It's called the Assisted Tree Range Expansion Project, and it's a community-based planting and monitoring initiative designed for private forest landowners in northwest lower Michigan. So first I'm going to take you through some of the basics on land tenure and regional forest stressors in the area, and then introduce assisted range expansion. Then I'll do an overview of the project and wrap up with some results from our perception evaluation and future directions for this work. So you might be aware that we have a very different land management paradigm in the States than here in Canada. Generally, there's a patchwork of both public and private lands across the country, but the level of each varies quite a bit. So in the western United States, you have more federally protected land, which is managed by the U.S. Forest Service. And then in the Midwest and eastern states, you have more private land stewardship. So in Michigan, we have 2 national parks and 3 national forests, which are indicated in the yellow and hot pink colors. And then we have a lot of state forest land, which is managed by the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, and that's in the blue color. As you can see in the peach color, though, private land ownership encompasses almost half of Michigan's forest landscape. So this includes just a few % of commercial forestry, and then is mostly comprised of individual and family landowners, as well as entities like schools, townships, and protected areas through lands and conservation organizations. In this map, it also includes indigenous lands, which in the Tri-County area that I worked in belongs to the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa. So this zooms in on that map a little more into the Tri-County region that I was in. It consists of Leelanau, Grand Traverse, and Benzie counties, and you can see further breakdown of the forest land ownership types. And then this pie chart is specifically for Leelanau County, but it's generally pretty representative of the other 2 counties as well. And as you can see, 73% of the land there is privately owned. So you might be wondering then how these private forests are managed, if at all. So across the country, we actually have this network of natural resource management offices called conservation districts. They were created over 75 years ago after the environmental devastation associated with the Dust Bowl. These offices are staffed with people who provide land use assistance and environmental education to private landowners and communities across the state. Then you have the Michigan Forestry Assistance Program, whose mission you can read here. And this is administered through professional foresters who work out of the conservation districts. So there's over 20 offices that provide coverage to 50 counties in Michigan. And this summer I was working for my external supervisor, Cameron Ross, who's the district forester in this region in the neon green here. So just a quick overview of the region's forests. It's a glacially formed landscape, so there's a lot of sandy loam soils that support a mix of pine and predominantly northern hardwood forest. There's also a fair amount of coastal forests and dune ecosystems along the coast of Lake Michigan, and most of it is all secondary forests due to intensive logging during settlement. These forests are not without their challenges. So there's a wide array of disturbances that are actually quite similar to the challenges faced here in southern Ontario. These are some of our main pests and pathogens. Beech bark disease in particular has been really devastating for the region. So maple beech forests account for about 25% of the forest type, and BBD has been working its way through the area since the year 2000. So we currently have our beech are dying off in really large numbers across the landscape. Our ash trees, of course, were decimated by the emerald ash borer. And we've also been experiencing a powerful wave of a non-native fungal pathogen called oak wilt, which creates concentrated areas of tree mortality and disproportionately affects red oaks. There's also concern about hemlock woolly adelgid and Asian longhorn beetle on the horizon. So as of 2019, HWA was detected just a few counties south of this region, and then Asian longhorn beetle is active on all sides of the state in Ohio, New York, and Illinois. So these 2 would be both really devastating for the region because hemlock and maple are very prevalent in the landscape. As for invasive species, I listed the woody ones here, but the list goes on. There's a top 20 list produced by the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network of species of the greatest concern. These are obviously problematic because of their propensity to dominate an area and prevent the regeneration of our tree species. Other stressors include the increasing frequency and severity of severe storm events and high pressure from deer browse, despite this being a popular hunting region. There's also an increasing trend of private lands being broken up into smaller and smaller parcels, which obviously has ecological consequences, but also makes it difficult to harmonize management practices across the landscape. So these are some pictures of the various forest stressors. This is a beech that's snapped due to BBD in somebody's yard in Leelanau County. This is a patch of oak wilt mortality in Benzie County. This was a pretty epic summer storm in 2015. This is a shelf cloud that ended up devastating this national park land. So this is a trail called Alligator Hill in Sleeping Bear Dunes National Park that was just completely wrecked. This is a pretty nasty invasion of Japanese barberry in the forest understory. And this is the face of herbivory in northwest Michigan. So then you have climate change, which is exacerbating all of these other stressors. Over the past century, much of the region has already warmed between 1 and 2 degrees Fahrenheit. These are projections from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science for mean daily temperature and mean annual precipitation. The columns within each figure represent 2 different climate change scenarios, so low emissions on the left and high emissions on the right. Temperature is expected to increase anywhere from 2 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. The models were kind of divergent in terms of their precipitation predictions, but the one thing that they did agree on was that precipitation was going to be delivered in more heavy rainfall events, so that's defined as greater than 8 centimeters in one event. We're also seeing indicators that ecosystems are already changing in tandem with these climate changes. So leaf out and flowering dates have already moved about a week earlier, and the predictions are for the growing season to lengthen from anywhere from 30 to 70 days by the end of the century. So changes in soil moisture patterns are leading to soils drying out later in the growing season, leading to drought stress. And winters are becoming less severe, which is incredibly problematic because usually our severe winters are what are keeping a lot of these forest pests at bay. And then all of these predictions are kind of pointing to the fact, or the prediction, that southern or temperate species in northern Michigan will be favored by climate change. So what are the main implications then for our forests and communities? I broke this up into ecological and socioeconomic aspects. So the loss of species diversity is making our forests less resilient to disturbances. Concentrations of tree mortality are allowing invasive species to get a stronger foothold. There's stifled regeneration within our forests because of the abiotic factors associated with climate change and pressure from deer browse. And then there's kind of unknown impacts on our wildlife populations that rely on the species that we're losing. And then in terms of socioeconomic aspects, there's the cost to private landowners associated with tree treatment and removal on their property, which can be really devastating both emotionally and financially. There's the overall decline of long-term property values, and then just the fact that forests are generally what make this region an attractive and valuable place, and they're really important to the lifestyle and the culture there. So as you can see, mitigating the impacts of these stressors and improving sustainable management of our forest landscape in northwest Michigan is a pretty important and pressing matter. So there are a range of methods being explored in order to improve the resilience of our forests in the face of this complex web of disturbances and climate change impacts, and one of those methods is assisted range expansion. So assisted range expansion can be defined as the intentional movement of species to areas just outside their established range in response to climate change, facilitating or mimicking natural range expansion. It should be differentiated from assisted population migration, which involves moving populations far outside of their current range, within their current range, and assisted migration, which involves moving populations far outside of their current range. And you can see from this NRCan graphic that this is really just one of many potential forest management tools being used in response to climate change. In general, these methods are increasingly being discussed in the forestry community as tree migration rates are predicted to lag significantly behind climate change and be impeded by a fragmented landscape. So there's been really limited research done on this topic in Michigan. I was only able to find one study conducted by the University of Michigan, and they found actually that there were no southern species whose survival was significantly lower in their northern canopy plots than any of the local species. So these results are promising, but clearly more research is needed. So this brings me to my project, the Assisted Tree Range Expansion Project. I wanted to make this a community-based initiative because, as you've learned, these challenges are playing out on a predominantly privately owned and managed landscape. So this means that addressing them and conducting any sort of management activities requires public education and engagement. So ATREP is designed to directly engage local citizens while assessing the success of assisted range expansion by collecting some much-needed basic data. The basic premise of the project is to get people to plant species that are projected to have suitable new habitat in the region, and subsequently monitor their plantings and report some simple annual measurements to the conservation district. So this is just an overview of the steps that were required to develop the project. You can see what's been done and what's still being worked on with the check marks. I won't go through every step, but I'll bring your attention to some of the main components. So there was the creation of my data collection protocol, a central website for the project, a range of outreach approaches, and then it'll culminate in our spring seedling sale where 750 trees will be distributed to participants. So species selection was obviously really important for this project. There's over 35 species whose ranges reach their northern limits in mid-Michigan, but we wanted to choose the ones that are predicted to have the most success for our region, and logistically we could only add a handful of species to the options for the spring sale. So these were some of our main criteria for choosing the species based on those previous forest stressors we talked about. And this is a table published by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. It models which species are projected to have either new suitable habitat in the region, which is indicated by the blue stars, or an increase in suitable habitat, which is indicated by the green triangles. So these were the 6 species we ultimately came up with. Another key consideration when picking these was what functional gaps they might be filling in our forest ecosystems. So for instance, the shagbark hickory and the swamp white oak are both mast trees that provide an important food source for wildlife, especially considering the loss of our beaches and their beech nuts. Hackberry also has drupes that persist late into the winter and provide another important food source for wildlife. And sassafras, blackgum, and tulip tree are all favorites for many bird species and native insect pollinators. So this is a series of screenshots from the project website. It's now live, but I highly discourage pulling it up on your phones because it's not formatted correctly. So this is where participants can go to just get some more basic information on the project, to submit their annual measurements through this data submission form, and they can interact with the project map here. So the project map has every tree that's been planted through the project will be on there, and then you can click on the tree and see the date it was planted, its height, and some notes on tree health and vitality. So our methods for project outreach have included the following. The logos and organizations on the right are just some examples of organizations and events that outreach was conducted this fall. Obviously, the bulk of participant recruitment is going to be done in the next few months leading up to the tree sale in the spring, but overall the initial reception from landowners has been really positive. So switching into a different gear here, I wanted to consider the relevance of this project in statewide context. So I knew from our classes and my literature review that the forestry and scientific community can be somewhat divided on the implementation of assisted migration options. So I wanted to evaluate the perception of Michigan's professional forester community on the topic. It's a limited pool. It's not all the professional foresters in Michigan, but it was distributed to the network of district foresters working for the conservation districts. So there's a total of 18 of them across the state, and 16 completed the survey, so it was a good turnout. The survey was designed to assess their openness to experimenting with assisted range expansion in Michigan. Most of the respondents were already familiar with the topic, but for anybody who wasn't, they were provided with a definition and literature. So overwhelmingly, the district foresters were in favor of experimenting with assisted range expansion in Michigan. 14 out of 16 would personally recommend this to their landowners that they are consulting. And so where we lost the 2 respondents there was basically the one who just is not in favor of it at all from the first question. And then the second one said that they are in favor, but they believe it should be exclusively the responsibility of research universities. And then overall, most of them indicated that they think it should be a combination of forestry actors, including themselves, private landowners, the Department of Natural Resources, the U.S. Forest Service, and research universities to be responsible for exploring this further. So then I also wanted to generally understand how important climate change considerations are to these foresters and the landowners they're working with. So I included this series of questions at the end of the survey. As you can see, for the most part, these foresters are rarely or never receiving questions from their landowners about the impacts of climate change on the forests in their region. But more often than not, they are initiating conversations with these landowners themselves. And then, importantly, the vast majority of them do consider it important to be incorporating climate adaptation strategies into the consultation that they're providing. So this really just demonstrated to me that my project could be a useful tool for these foresters to be bringing climate change into the fold of recommendations that they're making to their landowners. And I'll wrap up with some future directions for the project. It was approved through the board of the Leelanau Conservation District for a preliminary period of 5 years. So that means that they'll continue advertising the project, including it in their tree seedling sale, and it will be, project management responsibilities will be included in the description for the district forester job. Some tangible next steps include a GIS analysis of plantable space across the 3 counties to kind of see where to target planting efforts. And then they plan on informally publishing some annual reports with key numbers and findings. This is really important to kind of just, I think, drum up some more support for formal research and action among other local and state forestry actors. And then we want to strengthen local partnerships with local conservation organizations and host some educational workshops for landowners in the near future. So yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks to my internal supervisors, Tat and Danijela, for all your guidance and laughs we had this semester. A big thank you to Kama back in Michigan. I had so much fun with you this summer, and I learned a lot. Thanks for your endless support for this project.
Questions for Maddie?
What would the partnership with the local organization would bring to this project?
With these local conservation organizations? Yeah. So basically, these are just some local, these are conservancies, so those are land trusts that have they have landowners with conservation easements that they oversee. So the idea with connecting with them would be to be working with those people who have their land set aside for conservation purposes, with the idea that if we did plantings there, they won't be threatened by any potential development. And then the Wild Roots Initiative, this is basically they have a grant to be providing trees to private landowners at a discounted rate. So we're kind of hoping that if we can partner with them, maybe we could have some crossover between our landowners that we're working with.
I was just wondering, you had that table with all the species and how they're expected to fare under climate change. I was just wondering, what are some of the species that are expected to fare worse in the area?
Yeah, good question. So a lot of them, predictably, are like the more northern species, so like upland spruce and fir. I think you maybe stole Jay's question or something. Oh, okay.
I was saying these are plants and doggies. No, just kidding.
Yeah, so basically the more northern species like upland spruce and fir, and then there was like red pine, white pine, and aspen and birch were some others.
I was just wondering, to what extent did the forestry people you talked to, what was your impression about the key message of mitigation? I mean, you can view this, unfortunately, as window dressing if we don't address the big problem of emissions. So were these folks at all open to putting that message into their assisted migration message? Like, we're trying to do something here, guys, but the big problem is we got to reduce emissions. Now, in the U.S., that gets pretty political, as it should not, but it does.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering if if you guys talked about that.
This is another reason why I want to like do some workshops and have more conversations around this, because the survey, it was limited. Like there weren't many areas within the survey where they could go off on their own and type out an answer, right? So a lot of it was just selecting responses. So no, it didn't go into that. I think it should, but it's also hard at the same time, because when it's a really like intimate thing to show up at these people's, properties to give technical assistance, and there's always this fine line of like, how much do you want to start talking about lifestyle and general other trends? But I think that should be part of the conversation. And emissions.
I actually have a follow-up question. Jay, you may have answered it in answering the previous question before Jay's, but then Jay distracted me. So back to the question of the species that you didn't include on your list, and why not. There was some species that I kind of would have expected to see there. Basically more southern oaks. Why wouldn't they be included?
So we did include the swampway oak, and a big part of that was because we knew we needed some options for people with wetter sites, basically.
Right, so I'm thinking of all the dry site oaks,
Yeah, it's kind of, I do think that in the future, this project should expand to include more species. So this is great for like the first season, but I do think those would be like opportunities down the line. So yeah, they could be included. But in general, like the pin oaks and black oaks and whatnot, they kind of, there are a few of them already in these counties or some areas where we're seeing them, but they're kind of limited to this really sandy region in just Grand Traverse County in particular. So I think, like outreach that targets that county could include those down the line.
Okay.
Thanks. Good. I'm glad that is up on the screen, because it's exactly what I sort of wanted. Not really a question, but a dialogue. I'm from Niagara, and it would seem, except for the hackberry, all these trees up there, where I live, and but they're all gone from Toronto. I think the only one that isn't is here is the shagbark hickory, and I was told someone at lunch, it's in Mimico Creek, and it was put there by a conservationist-minded nurseryman around the turn of the century, and it's done well and survived, which shows. But, the accuracy of what you're saying, that sort of thing was actually done in the past. But I wonder if these species that, aren't in Toronto now may have been here in the past, and if we plant swamp white oak, sassafras, black gum, tulip tree, we could in some ways be doing the ecological restoration that these may have been wiped out in the 19th century.
Yeah, I think it's important to remind everybody that in the context here, it would be more like ecological restoration, whereas the region I'm talking about is at about 45 degrees north, so quite a bit more north from here. So these species really haven't been there historically. So I just want to point out the difference between those two things. Yeah.
One last question from Tat, and then we'll have a break.
Yeah, thanks, Maddie. Nice presentation. So in looking at your list and kind of wanting to build off some of the previous questions here, I wonder if you could just speculate as to what you think might be the most serious downside that they might experience in that area if they play out what you've proposed here. Is it likely to come from the way in which the species respond to the changes? Is it likely to be other factors that we should be aware of? What's the risk in playing this out?
Yeah, so in terms of risks, there is talk always about alteration of native ecosystems, but generally that's more of a concern with assisted population migration and assisted migration. For instance, all of these species actually have been recorded in the counties that we're in, just in smaller isolated populations, and there's been no evidence of them becoming invasive. Then I think the primary risk then just does become they don't work, basically. They either go into decline or die, and then that's a risk and a consequence that's felt by the landowner who's invested in this, and put time and energy and money. So I think that's kind of the main risk.
Okay, thank you, Maddie.